So let's take a look at what smartphone camera features there are. We'll learn a little bit about photography because if we're using a camera, it does help to understand what photography is. And then we'll take a look at what's going on with smartphone photography. Now, the iPhone has a camera, but it has a lot of features. So if we look at the iPhone camera, it does things like True Tone Flash, it has photonic engine, deep fusion, smart HDR5, portraits, portrait lighting, night mode, panorama, styles, wide color capture, lens correction, red eye correction, image stabilization, burst mode, and geo-tagging. And that's not everything. I mean, these are just what's listed on the camera features on Apple's website when you look at it. And there might be some other things like the type of lens and other things. This has nothing to do with the editing functions. This is strictly what's part of the camera. Now, if you thought this was a lot, the Google Pixel, which is regarded generally as one of the best quality Android cameras, has a lot of other features too. Best Take 16, photo and blur, motion mode, real tone, astrophotography, kind of interesting, motion autofocus, super res zoom, portrait, panorama, manual, live HDR. So this is just a lot of stuff going on. And I'm sure everybody knows what all of these are. So I'm not going to worry about repeating them because they're just some basic topics that everybody knows. When you buy a piece of technology and spend $500, $600, $700 on it, you probably go through and learn everything you can about it, I'm sure. But I'm going to try and break some of these down a little bit for you, just in case you didn't read the owner's manual. So why are there so many features here? Well, smartphone photography is really computerized photography. Your smartphone's a computer. It's pretty powerful. And when you use your smartphone to take a picture, it's not just capturing something on a sensor, which is the replacement for film and digital devices. It's using software built into the camera function of the phone in order to change and modify and make the photo better for you. So it's really computerized photography that's taking place in our smartphones. And basically, with computerized photography, you've got a camera and you got a computer, right? Because that's what you need. But you got to combine them together and you get a really sophisticated capability in your camera with your smartphone. So photography at a basic level, for those of you that never really learned photography, I took a bunch of photography classes when I was living in Atlanta. I wanted to take up photography. I got a digital single lens reflex camera. I took how to manage all of the options and features on it. But basically, photography is about capturing light. And so when you think of yourself as a photographer, you should think of yourself as somebody who is capturing light. Photography doesn't happen in the dark. When there's no light, there's no photography. Okay, so there has to be some light. There's actually one of the exercises we did in the photography class was called light painting, where one of our assignments was to go find as completely dark a spot as possible and then stand with a flashlight or a light source and you wave it around and scroll with it. And you can actually get the camera to capture your pattern with the flashlight if you leave the exposure open long enough. So it's interesting how you learn about light that way. Okay, cameras capture images and they have something called a lens and they have a sensor in digital cameras instead of a piece of film. By the way, ChatGPT was kind enough to generate this vintage photography image for me, which was really handy because, I mean, in the old days, this is what photographers did in the 1860s when photography was starting to become more of a profession. And there were professional photographers that were doing studio shots and, out in white nature and wild. They would have to time the lens opening with a stopwatch or timer, and they'd have to take their film back to a laboratory and develop the film. Now our sensors on our devices act as a piece of film, and our lenses are pretty much the same. They're just higher quality, and they have more capabilities. This film sensor function, it's electronic circuit. This is actually an opening of a digital single lens reflex camera with the lens taken off. That's what this ring does. And this is the sensor that is sensitive to light. And it has a lot of little tiny little dots on it called pixels. And it can be various sizes, and it can have so many pixels in it. And they generally have very, very dense types of information on them so that they can be sensitive to both light and color. They can pick up how much light is hitting each individual pixel, and they can identify the color that's hitting each individual pixel. And when you combine all these pixels together and you make them really, really compressed, the human eye can't tell the difference between the number of pixels, and we can't see them individually, and it looks like a continuous image. So that's our sensor, that's our film. There's some things that are kind of holdovers from old film cameras, which is why I mentioned that your film is the sensor now. The sensor has a certain amount of sensitivity to light, and the rating, it's called an ISO rating. It's the film speed. In the old days of chemical film negatives that were used in cameras, the film had a certain speed rating. The first film, obviously, they just guessed and estimated, and then they got more consistent manufacturing. But the film actually could take so much light, and then if you needed a certain amount of light to hit that film in order to get a picture, and that was called the sensitivity, and it started to be numbered in terms of a rating. So there's sensitivity for film, and you might remember this from old days. If you bought film at a store, you might remember a film that was rated 200, or a film that was rated 400, or a film that was rated 800. The higher the number, the less light you needed to create a picture on the film because it was more sensitive to light. So obviously, the more light you have, the less sensitive you need to have. Now, in digital technology with sensors, this is all controlled with the software. How much sensitivity do we want that sensor to have to light? And it's controlled automatically in the software or manually on some cameras. And when you have the most sensitive settings, meaning it is best to, the most least amount of light will create a picture, you don't get quite as much detail, and that creates something called grain. So when you're taking nighttime shots, they often aren't going to seem quite as sharp as a daytime shot, because the light in a daytime shot or a shot with light in your room is going to look better. That's why video and webcams need a lot of light to have a good webcam image for a Zoom meeting, is because these cameras are sensitive to light. But in your smartphone, the software is controlling the sensitivity of the sensor as to how much light it needs to create an image. That makes sense to everybody? Okay, because we're going to go through a couple more things. The lens controls the amount of light that gets onto the sensor. That's the purpose of the lens. It's also there to focus, but on smartphones, we typically have a fixed focus lens, whereas on higher quality cameras, you have lenses where you can adjust the focus. But on our smartphones, we've got a fixed focus lens, but it has a couple of things going on. The size of the opening is called the aperture. It basically determines how wide that opening is on a lens, and how long it's open is called the shutter speed. So if you have a lens that's open, say, let's talk in inches, for example, it's open a half an inch, and you can have a shutter speed that's 1 second, or you can have a shutter speed that's 1/100th of a second. So that 1/100th of a second shutter speed means it's only letting in light for a very, very short amount of time. One of the advantages of higher shutter speeds is it stops motion more. So generally, when you want to stop motion, you want as high a shutter speed as possible. So on cameras, the lens aperture opens up wider in order to let more light in at a slower shutter speed or faster shutter speed. The faster the shutter speed, the more light you need to have coming in through the opening of the lens, or you can do something else with the sensor too. We'll talk about that in a minute. So you have the lens and you have the sensor, and this is what's happening. So the aperture, the size of the lens opening, plus the shutter speed, which is the time the lens is open, really determine how much light's going to hit that sensor. Of course, the light you have in the scene you're taking a picture of affects it as well. So if you're in daylight, you have a lot more light to work with. So you have a little more control or options available with your aperture and shutter speed. If you're getting darker, you have less light that you can use to record the picture. So you have fewer options. Or if you have a lot of fast motion that you want to stop, you might have some limits on your options too. So we got sensor and light. There's also something called a field of view. And this is the angle that your lens can see. We have a field of view that our eyes look at. So if you've ever had an eye exam or heard about one, you know that some things that they test is how far you can see without turning your head, how far to the left or the right. That's your angle of view. And most cameras come with something very similar to what we see, so that if you take a picture, it'll look fairly natural because it'll capture what we would normally see with our own two eyes. But sometimes things are far away, so you might have a reason for something called a telephoto view, where you can zoom in on something, or things might be too close, or you want a wider angle to capture more width than what your normal view is. And so you have a wide angle view. And so there is a function in lenses called a zoom function that allows you to move in and out depending on what you want to see and what you want to have contained in the picture. So this is a picture I took during a bicycle trip in Spain, and it was one of my favorite ones because it's a great display of what I call depth of field. You can see these plant buds are in focus and the building behind is out of focus. That's what's called depth of field. Okay, so depth of field means that everything could be in focus that you look at, or only some things can be in focus. And a lens has the ability to manage that with the aperture control that you have the ability to do it. So the more you have a focus, a smaller aperture, the more things will be in focus from front to rear. So exposure is going to talk about aperture, how wide the opening is of the lens, the speed, how long the lens stays open, and the sensitivity of the sensor or film. And that ends up creating your exposure. So in your phone is a computer that balances aperture, shutter speed, and sensitivity to take photos. It's automatic. You do not adjust your own aperture. You do not change the sensitivity of the film. You can do it digitally now because we have digital sensors, but you used to have to change your film out if you had a problem. But now you can do it digitally. And then you don't typically adjust your shutter speed. You just point your camera on your phone and tap the shutter button. And so all of this is taking place automatically on your phone and controlled by the computer and the software that makes it work on your computer. And It's making decisions for you. It's making decisions, which is more important, shutter speed or sensitivity or aperture. And the more light you have, the easier it is for it to make a decision. The less light you have, like we get into nighttime or dark photos, the fewer the options are that your computer in your phone has in order to make a decision on exposure. So something will get sacrificed a little bit because it'll have to make the sensor really, really sensitive. It'll have to open up the aperture really, really wide, and the shutter speed might be really, really slow. So you might not be able to stop motion as well at night as you can in the daytime, for example. So, but the computer is doing the best it can with all the things it can do with a camera and a sensor, a lens and a sensor. So smartphones have some limitations, but some advantages. The sensor, which is represented by this little chip here, and the lens, which is represented by this opening, are really, really small on our smartphones. Okay, so that means that you can only open up the lens so far, and the sensor is only so big. For how small it is, it really takes pretty amazing photos, right? We really get some really good photos out of it. A larger camera will have more lens options. They typically come with interchangeable lenses, wider openings, better range of focus. They come with manual control, so you can manually control the shutter speed, the aperture, and the sensitivity to make your own judgments, or you can let it do the automated functions. And you have the ability to take a much more larger area using a larger sensor, which generally produces extremely high quality photographs. But it doesn't mean your photographs on your phone are bad. It just means that you may never need these other situations, but some people that want to use them can get them if they care about them. So smartphone cameras are doing two things for us. Well, they do a lot of things, but the two main things I kind of broke it down to. They're doing this auto exposure where they're managing the aperture, the shutter speed, and the sensitivity and coming up with the best balance. But they're also doing something called auto enhancements, which we're going to start getting into. So let me take a pause and take a sip of coffee and see if we have any questions. Anybody have any questions for now? Yeah, Melissa.
I was just wondering on that picture that you showed us that you took in Spain, and I think you called it depth of field.
Right.
What device did you use for that? Because I take all my pictures with an iPhone. Is that depth of field effect that you got, is that possible on an iPhone, or did you use a different device?
I used my own digital single lens reflex camera. I had manual control over the aperture. When you take a picture and you point out something really, really good, that when you take a picture with a smartphone, you will typically not get any depth of field effect at all.
Okay, thank you.
However, there's this thing called auto enhancements that may work for you. Okay, so some of those things we talked about earlier, portrait mode and other things, the software in the camera, because it's a computer, can sometimes give you the option to create a depth of field effect.
Oh.
So it's something you can do.
Is this something that they create in the camera, or something you do afterwards to edit the photo as far as depth of field go?
Generally, you need to use the portrait mode for taking the picture first. Okay. But there are many advanced editing capabilities that may give you the ability to create some effects afterwards, but it's generally something you want to do when you take the picture to get depth of field. Now that I've taught you about depth of field, you're going to want to try portrait mode on your phone. And what you want to do is try what's called a still life. I'm going to show you when we did one of the photography classes with iPhone and Android, I used a bottle of wine and an apple. So just find a table somewhere in your kitchen or other area, turn up a lot of light, point your camera at them, and then you'll see an option for portrait mode in your camera options, and try different things out to see how it works. Because a lot of these photos, good photographers practice taking a lot of photos in different situations. And so if you're in a situation, say, gee, I really wish I could remember how to take that portrait mode photo, but something moves or changes or goes away, you've lost the opportunity sometimes to do it. But the enhancement features that are available in smartphone cameras may give you the ability to do some of the things you want, but not necessarily to the degree you get. Now, Ronald was here earlier. He mentioned that, the Eclipse is one situation where smartphone cameras really weren't very good. And so people use more sophisticated cameras and special lens filters to do different things for them. But the enhancement capabilities are really strong in terms of what photos you can get out of your phone too. So let's take a look at some of the enhancements that are happening for you that you may not even know about.
Bob, when I do portrait, it tells me that the camera doesn't find any person. Is that a problem?
Generally, you have to find an object, a person or a object that it can focus on, because it's going to try to identify the object you want to be in focus. And as long as it can make out some kind of a main object, then it can defocus the other areas around it.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Okay. One of the things your smartphone does is it takes multiple images every time it takes a photo. It's not just taking one snapshot. It's taking a lot of different images. I don't know exactly how many because I couldn't find out, but somebody may do some research on that at some point. But it takes multiple images and then it combines them to get a higher quality photo. So when you click your shutter button, it's just not taking a picture when you are taking the picture. Sometimes it's taking an image even before you tap the shutter button, but it's just not saving anything. But when you tap the shutter button, it's taking, because it's a computer, it can do things really fast. So it takes multiple images and then it combines them to create the highest quality image for you. It does a couple of things when it's doing this. It makes light adjustments. So one thing we don't like about photos is if they're too dark in some areas or too light in some areas. The computer software in your camera balances the light and dark areas automatically. So a black is black and a white is white, and everything else is in between. So it makes these light and dark areas look a little bit better. It makes color adjustments. There is something called white balance, and sensors in film cameras and sensors in digital cameras really want to know where pure white is. Okay. And sometimes it's in the picture. Other times they have to kind of guess what is white. And so all color, it varies a lot based on what's called the white balance. So if you had a spot of your image that was exactly white, your camera would use that to determine how all the other colors were in relationship to white. But it also can balance things for skin tones, and it can balance color for scenes. So if you're taking a beach scene or a forest scene or a scene of animals or other things, it can balance the colors based on the kind of scene you have, and it'll automatically detect that for you. So it's balancing color all the time for you automatically, which is one reason why our photos come out looking really pretty good on our smartphone. So we've got it balancing light and dark areas. We've got it balancing color. The iPhone has something called a True Tone Flash that actually has two different colors of flash. One's a white, one's kind of an off-white that's a little more subtle. and it balances the colors and determines which flash to use based on what it thinks you're taking a picture of ahead of time. And it can balance that color from the flash too. Autofocus. I don't know when the last time you focused your smartphone camera was, but we don't bother doing it. But some lenses do need autofocus, but our smartphone lenses are what's called a fixed focal length, meaning they have a certain area that they have in focus all the time, and they are basically focusing. And so your phone can automatically pick the points you want to focus on, and it'll automatically focus on those parts of the image to make sure. So if you have an image with, say, a dozen people, it'll use facial recognition to determine how to focus that exposure so that it combines them. And it uses multiple images. The color balancing, the autofocus, they use multiple images. So if, in case you haven't noticed, even if you accidentally shake your camera up and down, it still seems to get a picture in focus. So it's got what's called image stabilization that takes place as well, that is being done when you're using it for taking images. That's reducing the blurring from shaking. So by taking several pictures, the software in your phone's camera can combine them and determine where edges should be clear. And so if there's a blurring, if there's some motion that takes place during a photo, during a shot, it can balance that out by having these multiple images and stabilize the image as well. So it has optical image stabilization, which means it's using the lens and the capability to do it, but it also has digital image stabilization as well, digital, which can use the computer to stabilize the image, because it's pretty rare we get an out of focus picture these days with our smartphones. We know to hold them steady, but even if you don't hold them too steady, you're going to get typically a good exposure. Red eye correction takes place automatically. When you use a flash to take a picture of eyes, the reflection off the back of the eye produces a red effect. It's from, the blood in the eye that is reflecting black into the camera. So this is happening automatically. You don't have to do anything about it anymore, and it makes it pretty good. So eyes look more natural when you're taking a portrait, when you're taking a shot of an animal or pet or anything with eyes that might reflect light from a flash. Lens correction. I don't know how many of you have ever seen a fisheye lens picture where as you go out, it kind of gets distorted on the edges and kind of looks really funny. Things don't look like they're proportion, perspective doesn't look right. So when you're using a wide angle type of lens where you have a lot of the width of the image in focus, or you're using a telephoto where what you're focusing in on is very narrow, you get something called lens distortion. It's just an optical effect that takes place. It's physics. And it's possible, however, in software, of course, because you've got a computer camera, right? You can correct lens distortion from wide angle shots and telephoto shots, and it's doing this for you automatically without you having to even think about it. Something called high dynamic range. This has got a really dark area in it, and it's also got a really light area in it. And high dynamic range adjusts what are called highlights and shadows. So it adjusts them so they are balanced, so that they don't get washed out and they don't show up too dark. You can see in the shadow, you can actually see a few grains of grass here, which is an adjustment that was made in this photo so that it's not completely black. Okay, in the darkest part of the shadow, it is black, but as you get further away, you can see the shadow is not completely black, because if it were completely black, you couldn't see any of these grass fronds. But in the light areas, you can see some of the cracks in this ball, even though it's pretty close to white. So high dynamic range makes sure that you get a little bit of detail in the white areas and a little bit of detail in the shadow dark areas so that it looks like a more natural, understandable photo for people. That's happening with your smartphone computer. You've also got something called geotagging. If you look in your phone library or photo library on iPhones and Android phones, whenever you take a photo, as long as your phone is connected up to the internet, it has the ability to identify its location. If it can get a GPS signal, it gets a real precise location. So in the data about your photo, your phone's computer is taking the latitude and longitude, if it picked it up from GPS, and it's adding that data to your photo so that it is giving you a location of where it was taken. That's called geotagging. That's happening automatically. So these are just some of the things your phone is doing for you because it's a computer, right? Just doing a lot of things for us all the time. So portrait mode, this is actually a picture I took during the photography, session I was doing. And you can see how the bottle and the apple are in focus, but as you look at the blinds in the background, they're blurred out. This was portrait mode with a smartphone camera that focuses in on this area. So you might have to move your phone in and out to determine what you want it to be on focus on. But I recommend you try it on a still life. I mean, a bottle of wine and an apple are a classic still life. You can come up with your own objects, but an apple has a lot of good color and definition to it. A bottle of wine has good, curves and shadows, so it helps, your lens for your computer focus. Now, it's not adjusting necessarily the aperture to give you that depth of field, because with a camera that has a wide aperture lens, you can create a very narrow depth of field. So like you can create something where things are only in focus within a couple of feet and everything either in front of it or in back of it are out of focus. So portrait mode is duplicating that effect in software for you. And so you've got a computer that's doing all this for you, and it gives you the option to create these portrait mode depth of field effects where things in the background are out of focus and things that you want to keep in focus are in focus. Well, not bad for a phone, camera, because it's got a computer, and Android and Samsung and Apple are building all of these software capabilities into our camera app in our smartphones, so we get all of these capabilities out of them. Okay, so one of the things I want to go back to is talk a little bit about the difference between a larger camera and a smartphone camera. Larger cameras like Nikons and Sonys and Canons, which are very popular brands, they do have automated functions. They do have software, so they can use them on automatic, and it'll make the best decisions about the types of things you're doing. But they have a bigger lens, and they have interchangeable lenses, so you can get a lot more variability in the control of what you can do with that camera, because you can manually control the shutter speed. You can manually change the lens and get lenses that are long telephoto lenses, or short wide angle lenses, or fisheye, or what are called macro lenses that give you the ability to take pictures really close up. Our iPhones and Android phones do have a macro mode that will automatically sense if you're holding something really close to the camera and focus in on that. But you just have more options with a camera that gives you that capability. But that's really the only difference. Otherwise, the capabilities you have in a smartphone with multiple lenses. It has typically, if you spend more money on a smartphone, you're going to get a better set of lenses. You're going to get a more sensitive sensor. So when you think about a free phone you get from, say, a cellular service that doesn't cost anything, one of the areas that phone is going to cut back on is in terms of the quality of the sensor and the quality of the lens. And so you'll have more limitations. The software is going to be more capable in the higher end. So that's why some people spend a lot of money on a smartphone, as it gets better quality lenses, maybe more than one lens. Sometimes a smartphone only has one lens, and they get better sensors in them that have more pixels that can accommodate that sensitivity. So those are just a few of the things that you'll get from your smartphone camera. So let me get some coffee here. And I hope I haven't overwhelmed you with features, because we didn't go into everything, because everything is way too much. I just wanted to go, and I didn't understand some of these things also, so I didn't want to have to do all the research on them, but there are just so many capabilities. So let's open it up for Q&A. Joe, you got your hand up. Thank you, Joe, for raising your hand. Go ahead and unmute.
Okay. A couple of things. One of which, you mentioned the GPS and the information that's in the picture. You may want to mention that you can turn that feature off. At least I think you can.
You can.
And the reason why you would want to turn it off, basically because, especially if you have pictures of kids and you make them public, all somebody has to do is click on the info and they get the information about, where the child is at, where they're at school, the location of everything, all that kind of good stuff. And the other thing is, I got an unintentional fisheye lens effect on my phone one time. I was in a relatively small room with lots of mirrors. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but it was about a 20 by 15 room, and had lots of equipment, repetitive equipment. They were basically stationary bikes, and I wanted to get some kind of neat photo. So I used a panorama view, took the picture, and went through the corner of the room, and it came out, when I finished with it, it came out looking like a fisheye lens had taken the picture. It looked like it was curved out instead of the corner showing. So that was just kind of an interesting side note. Okay, that's it. I'll take my hand down, or it's down already. Okay.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Carol.
So I have an older cell phone. It's probably only like $200, but I know when I take pictures, it takes a while. It takes like a bunch of seconds before I see that picture pop up. And I think sometimes I see it focusing like in and out. Do you know anything about that?
Is it a smartphone or?
Yeah.
Well, it could be that you're, depending on the software and the processor speed remember, you're relying on a computer to calculate a lot of things to take a picture. So if it's just a slow smartphone with a slower processor, it's not going to be able to take pictures very rapidly. With things like, higher end iPhones and newer Android phones, higher end Androids, they have a feature called burst mode, where they can actually take anywhere from 10 to 20 pictures per second. Higher end cameras can do even more, and scientific cameras that take photos of neutrons and particle colliders take, you get even more. But how long it takes your phone to reset before it takes another picture can be a factor in the computer that's powering your camera more than anything else.
Thank you.
Sure. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi. I have a question about selfie. They never turn out well when I take them, and I always think maybe my arm is too short. And when my son-in-law sends me selfies of him and his family, then they look okay, you know.
Well, sometimes depending on your phone, the selfie, when you are taking a selfie and you swivel to the front facing camera instead of the rear camera that faces away from you when you're looking at your phone screen, that's the best quality camera. So it has a better lens, it has more sensitivity. The front camera has a different sensor and it's less sensitive and a different lens. And so holding it steadier is more important when you're doing a selfie like that. So having a steady arm is really critical in order to be able to get good photos with a selfie. And obviously having enough light coming on you is important as well. And some phones have a minor difference between the front and the rear camera. Some have a big difference between the front and the rear camera. And if people take a lot of pictures, they'll generally get a newer quality phones, typically upgrade the quality of the cameras in both front and rear.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I do have just to Google. I mean, well, anyway, a smartphone, and he's an Apple. Maybe this is the difference. The other question I have: there's always the direction you take a picture. I mean, let's see, a landscape. The sun seems to be in your back, no? The sun makes a lot of difference. Yeah.
Yes. Don't point your camera towards the sun. Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Having the light behind you is very helpful when you're taking a picture.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks. So thanks, Joe, by the way, for the GPS information. Some people don't realize they're sharing GPS when they take photos of children and things like that. But it's recorded with your phones. And sometimes that data is associated with the photo when it gets posted online. So it's something to be careful of. I know a lot of parents of small children, they just do not post any pictures of their children anywhere as to avoid that type of thing. So thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, Melissa, go ahead.
Okay, 2 quick questions, and it's specifically related to my iPhone 14 Plus. I don't have the Pro level. And we were talking about how the smartphones do a lot of stuff automatically for us, but there are some settings that we kind of have to go in and figure out if we want to enable or not enable. And my specific first question is under my camera settings. There is a section on composition. And there are terms that I don't understand, so I don't know if I want to enable them or not. The 3 terms are grid, level, mirror, front camera. I don't know if I want to enable those or not.
Well, there's a principle in photography and art called the rule of thirds. Okay, so if you take an image, I'm going to find a whiteboard here for a second if I can, and see if I can draw it for you. Okay, so let's take a whiteboard here. And if I take a grid, an area, a square, for example, and I draw and separate it into thirds like this, and excuse my thirds, these areas where these separate, where these lines intersect, are generally are areas where our eyes are drawn to. Just a principle that the Greeks discovered. And so when they created the Parthenon and other things like that, they discovered that the rule of thirds worked very well for focusing people's eyes on certain features. So composition, turning on the grid, will turn on a set of lines that will show up on your camera when you look at that all the time. Is
that a good thing?
You can try it out, see if it helps you compose better pictures. The other option is obviously when you take a picture, you can edit it. So people think that having the person in the center of a picture is the best thing. But if you look at like TV shows, for example, where they have people, they're always facing, to the side a little bit as opposed to facing head on. And that moves their head to a little bit to the left, moves it a little bit off center, which tends to people tend to think that's a little more interesting composition is all.
Okay.
Okay,
So
well,
go ahead.
What were
Go
the
ahead.
other settings?
Oh, it was grid, level, and mirror front camera.
Right.
I don't know what that means.
Mirror front camera. So if I had something in back of me with some lettering on it, and I did not have my front camera mirrored, it might read backwards. So mirroring your front
Oh.
camera, because it's your selfie camera pointing at you, if you
Right.
want to make sure like the lettering on your shirt or blouse or jacket or something in the back of you is clear and reads correctly, you want to mirror your front camera because it
Okay.
inverts the image.
Okay.
We can do that on Zoom too. You can invert the camera on Zoom. And so that's what mirroring does. And
Okay. Level.
level is just basically a level marker, show you, okay, is it straight? Is your camera straight or not?
Okay, so all these things are good things. Okay, and then my second question, just real quickly, is I now understand what portrait mode is, but there are a couple other ones that I do not understand what they are. One is cinematic, and the other one, oh, maybe that's the only one I don't understand. Cinematic is the one I don't understand.
Well, if you buy a new smart TV, one of the options you'll have is the ability to use it in standard, vivid, or cinematic. So cinematic kind of refers to the lighting effect that is created to give it a more cinema look to the lighting, and the edges and the sharpness of it is all it does.
Oh, okay, so I'll experiment, see if I like it.
Experiment. See if you like it better or not. You can always you can always edit the photo as well.
That's
And
true.
it doesn't destroy the original photo. It just changes settings if you want to use it that way too. So it's just a matter of trying out your creativity and see which effect you like best.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, let's go to Joe, then Carl, then Ronald. Go ahead, Joe.
I'll tell you what. Why don't you take the other guys, and if you have time for me, that's fine. If not, that's okay too. So
Okay,
take
all
them
right.
first.
Go ahead, Carl.
Wait a sec. There you go. So first I got mixed up between portrait and landscape. So it probably happened to other people. And I don't understand a lot about photography, but I was thinking portrait and landscape. You're not talking about portrait and landscape. What you're talking about is the person in front of you.
A mode of photography, right.
Background's not so important. It's the person. It's focusing on the person. So now I understand that because I had to have Gemini explain it to me. I wasn't sure what you meant. So Gemini said, and portrait mode on a smartphone camera is a setting designed to mimic the effect you get with a professional camera, a sharp focus on the subject with a blurred background. And the blurred background effect is called something called bokeh. But anyway, now I understand portrait mode. I was way out. I was going in the wrong direction.
You're thinking portrait like this dimensions, right?
Right. Person. So
right. Because lots of times a portrait format is vertically tall, horizontally narrow. Landscape is considered, wide and wider than it is tall from a dimension standpoint. But portrait mode is about creating a depth of field effect, right?
And the background, you can play with the background too. Do you want them to see the background or not see a little bit of it, more of it? So there's a game there in the background.
Sometimes there's some adjustments on that as well. And sometimes you actually have the ability to focus the light, there's a lighting effect as well in portrait mode too, because obviously you don't have a lot of control over how you determine what's going to be light and what's going to be dark in a smartphone camera, because a lot of these things are happening automatically.
Yeah. And the HDR, is that part of the portrait mode? Really? The HDR?
HDR is independent of portrait. Can
Okay.
happen. It can happen in any photo, and normally it's an automatic setting. And you can actually download other camera apps for your phone that give you the ability to mimic, manual controls if you want to.
Right.
But they do take, a little learning and practice. And there's so many features that are standard in our smartphones, we don't necessarily even need them.
So the HDR that you showed had nothing to do with portrait. So you got me a little bit mixed up there. But that was fascinating that you could still see the grass in the black area and you could still see the cracks in the light area. So that's 100% on that one. I'm glad you showed that one. And there was one little other thing. I want to ask you a question. You remember that geotagging slide you had? Did you build that slide yourself? Did you make that slide yourself or did you grab it? Because that's a brilliant slide. I like that. Did you make it or did you grab it?
It's a stock photo.
Okay, thank you. I'm finished.
Yeah. I wish I should have taken credit for it, but it's a stock photo. I think I got it from the Microsoft PowerPoint library.
Bob, could you do it? Could you create that? Yes or no? I'm just curious.
It would be a lot of work.
Okay, good.
It'd take a couple hours of work because the way it was all laid out, the color, the shading effects on the geotags and other things.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Ronald, go ahead.
Okay, quick. First to Joe's comment, he's absolutely right about the metadata. You don't always have to turn it off when you're taking your pictures. There are software and apps that will strip it out before you go to post on any sort of social media. You're absolutely right. If you're going to post anything that you don't want to have people knowing all that information, it's a good idea to just strip that off. I just want to tell you before the aliens abducted you. The other thing is you tweaked my interest there, Bob, as you always do. You mentioned in your intro something called deep fusion. And I'm not going to press you to find because that may have been one of the things you didn't want to look up. So I did. And it's an image processing system found in Apple smartphones that improves images in low light environments. So it may be doing some of that, where you had the grass and the ball and things like that. But interestingly, it answered the question that you hadn't been able to find the answer to, and I was looking too. So one of the Apple's people, one of their spokesmen said, Deep Fusion works by snapping 9 images in total, 4 images before you press the shutter button and 4 secondary images. And interestingly, 1 long exposure when you press down on the shutter. And then the neural engine in the bionic chip analyzes the image, talking about computing, analyzes the image, merges the regular and long exposure shots, selecting the pixels one by one to optimize for details and low noise. The result is one fine, highly detailed photo.
Amazing.
So that just blew me away. I mean, I know live photos will take it, but I didn't know until you told us about this that it takes 4 before, 4 after, and 1 quote unquote long exposure, all in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, it's I didn't know that about deep fusion. I didn't look up all the terms, obviously, because there's just so many.
Yes.
But like I say, this is and when you talk about Apple AI, this is where Apple is using artificial intelligence and machine learning, is they're using it in the back end of the applications. It's invisible to us that what's happening, because this is why our pictures all come out looking pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So,
well, thank you, Joe, for waiting. What do you have to add for us, or do you have a question?
Well, yeah, it's just a point of interest, I guess. I wanted to take a UPC code, and I wanted to put that onto a name tag because I didn't want to have to, when I went somewhere and I go there regularly, you wear a little name tag. So I wanted to put that on the name tag so I could use that instead of having to get out the separate little gizmo and put it across the flasher. Well, at any rate, so I took a photo of it. Well, when I took a photo of it, you have the black lines, and I put it on a white field, white background, and it was, a great picture. But the background, which was white, came out kind of grayish. And
Yeah.
I don't, and when I tried running it through the sensor, it wouldn't read it because it was too much gray. So I went back in and used the editor, which is a separate thing from what you're talking about here. But I used the Google Photos, and I just told it to lighten things up and turn the background white, and the black was still black, and ran it through the sensor again. Boom, worked like a charm.
Right. What you're talking about is the difference between sometimes when you point your camera at something, you can take a photo or you can scan it. A photo uses all the light balance to create a grayscale in a photo, which is why you had a kind of a grayscale on that original image. A scan will create high contrast, which is the difference between scanning mode on cameras and photo mode on cameras. So photo is going to have more grayscale in it to do that.
Okay.
That's why that happened. Yeah. So that if you have a scan mode in your app or your camera, and Google Photos, I think, has a scan mode, and OneDrive and iPhone Notes and Apple Notes do as well.
Yeah, I think it does too. I just didn't know what it was at the time. So
yeah, I've done that
okay.
sometimes by accident, as I've taken a photo of something to do it. So Ron's posted something in chat. Just tell us what
that is. That's the link to the information on Deep.
Link to the article. Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't know how many photos it actually took when it took.
Me neither. I had done a search. We could have had Carl talk to Gemini about that, but
Carl was trying to figure out portrait, mode here.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I hope this helped you understand a little bit more about all the things your smartphone's doing for you.
Yeah.
And if you go out and try and experiment with some photos, feel free to share them in the Tech Explorer community, let us know about them. We can all get an idea of types of things people are doing and sharing and practicing. And I will, the next session at 2:30 I'm doing today, I want to experiment around with Zoom whiteboards. It has like almost no agenda to it. So we're just, for people that are interested in exploring some of the upgrades on Zoom that took place, particularly with whiteboards, and we might have a chance to look at some other things that took place in Zoom as well. But whiteboards is now available through Zoom while you're in a meeting, and also available outside of a meeting also. So if you're interested in trying something out, we can see what happens outside of a meeting too. After we leave, and see if we can get to those whiteboards too. Yeah, well, thank you everybody for coming, and I will see some of you again in a little while.
Yep. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks. Sure thing.
2:30,
Hang
right?
on, let me get the closed caption transcript here.
Save the file.
Seconds.
Okay. And I always get a copy of it. If you happen to not get it, Joe, and you need a copy, I can always send you my download that I get.
Okay, hang on. Got it. Thank you.
Okay, great. You're welcome. Thanks.
All right.
Easy, everyone. See you in a little while.
Bye-bye.
Bye.